Hello, I'm Nicholas Feinberg of Pleasing Fungus Games. Back in 2010, I made a puzzle game about state machines called Manufactoria, which there's a small chance someone here has heard of. And then I made some other games that you definitely haven't heard of. And in less than a week, I'm releasing another puzzle game about hardware design, and this one's called Silicon Zeros. The games I make tend to be pretty technical, so obviously what I want to talk about today is storytelling, history, and inclusiveness. So, the first question is, why is story important for a puzzle game? Silicon Zeros is a game about building machines that solve problems. It's not an epic fantasy quest. There aren't AI-driven characters getting in fights. There isn't a physics engine causing big messes. There are just circuits that you carefully place and wire together. In short, it's a game that by default could end up feeling pretty soulless. For exactly that reason, I wanted to emphasize story, to suffuse the game with character and personality, which it might otherwise lack. And that turned out to be easier said than done. So the first problem was to decide on a theme for the game. I considered a number of, fancy metaphors. Maybe the game would be set in the ancient Middle East, with camels carrying data blocks from oasis to oasis, and that's what you can see there. That's the concept. Or maybe I could go with the Kingdom of Adders and Friends, a magical quest to throw off the tyranny of the subtractors. Trying to flesh those ideas out, though, led me to the conclusion that they hurt more than they helped. Silicon Zeros is a game that expects the player to master some pretty complicated concepts over the course, and so wrapping those concepts in elaborate metaphors just made them harder to understand. The simplest theme, in the end, was literal. You're building hardware. And where better to set a game about designing hardware from beginning to end than the beginning of modern computer design? Silicon Valley in the 60s, when all the big semiconductor companies were just getting started. That was the place to be. Once I had a theme for my game story, I had to figure out how to deliver that theme to the player. My first attempt was focused on the puzzle select screen, an electronics lab with the puzzle names written on the blackboard, and there's some very early concepts here. I think you can see which one of them is my art. You might be able to guess that one, and which one is the artist's. So in this attempt, the player's coworkers would stand in front of the blackboard, and you'd click on them to enter little vignettes, conversations that furthered plot or characterization. As you progressed, the characters would move around the blackboard and move around the lab, and the set of available vignettes would change. This sounded good, at least to me, but it conflicted with the game's structure. Silicon Zeros wants you to be flowing through the puzzles. Beat one puzzle, go straight to the next. The vignette structure wants you to be pausing between each puzzle and stop and look for new story nuggets. Oh, has anyone changed? Are there new conversations available? Silicon Zeros wants to put puzzles in parallel. There's a couple. There's only one fork. Anyway, so that you can choose the order you do them in and switch sort of tracks when you get stuck. The vignette structure wants a linear plot, so that all the vignettes can sort of switch out at the same time, and you get things that actually make sense together. Basically, it was a mess. So instead, I decided to integrate the characters in the story more directly into the puzzles, rather than putting them to the side. I'd have a different role for each character. One would give instructions, another would give hints, a third would talk while your hardware was being tested, and a fourth would leave comments in the programs that your hardware was supposed to run. That seemed like a much better idea. Until I scrapped the hint system, failed to find a way to give interesting comments on testing, and discovered that playtesters just found comments in code really confusing and misleading. It made them think that, oh, look, there's someone writing in here. I guess there's just sort of flavor off to the side. And they made them think the code was flavor, too. So those got scrapped. What I was left with was the idea of a small cast of characters and puzzle descriptions being written in those characters' own voices. That was the part that stuck. Now I just had to figure out two small things: who those characters were and what story they would be part of. Little things. Since my game's theme was at least loosely historical, I just started by looking at history for inspiration. In particular, I read up on the life of a man who was central to early Silicon Valley, Robert Noyce. Bob Noyce's life was a goldmine for drama. He started his career in Silicon Valley working for someone who it's not entirely unfair to call a mad scientist, Dr. William Shockley. He betrayed Shockley and led the Traitorous Eight to found a competitor, Fairchild, and where he went on to co-invent the integrated circuit And then he decided that wasn't enough, and he went on to co-found Intel. His employees betrayed him, he betrayed his wife. Not admirable, but interesting. So early versions of Silicon Zeros were very heavily based on Noyce's life, centering on those many betrayals. Even the name was inspired by it. But the cast was small, I mentioned that earlier. So instead of the Traitors 8, the game was We Traitors 5. The problem came when I tried to reconcile all those betrayals with the overall mood of the game, the recklessly optimistic spirit of a startup that was busy changing the world. I got writer's block continuously, I couldn't get anywhere, something had to give. So I tried various other ideas. What if the tone was like sitcom-ish and competent, something like Silicon Valley the Show, or Veep, or something like that? Or what if somehow everyone was getting mixed up in international spycraft, and like there's foreign spy agencies trying to buy your chips? I did having chosen a name for the game, and announced it on my blog and everything. Gotten the logo. I did everything I could to salvage that name. But ultimately I couldn't. I changed the story to be a more grounded, mostly positive take of a tale of a young company on the rise. And though it nearly killed me, I changed the name. Part of being a good game developer, or a good creator generally, is having the humility to give up on ideas that just don't work out. I just wish I'd done it sooner. So, I now had a theme and a plot, the rise of an early Silicon Valley hardware startup. I still needed a cast, and for that I had a problem. I wanted a diverse cast, something that wouldn't leave players feeling excluded or alienated. But if you look at picked photos of those early hardware startups, diverse is not a word that comes to mind. Would a diverse cast in the period be ahistorical? Would it be ridiculous? Would it be a kind of lying, erasing the real problems and the discrimination of the past? And those are the sort of questions that come up when you set your plot in history. Part of the answer was to do more research. Programming was historically a female-dominated profession, and in the 60s, when the game takes place, men still hadn't quite taken over like they more or less have today. Manufacturing was another opening. The chips that Fairchild and other companies made were hand-assembled, mostly by women, many by Navajo, and other people of color. Those pictures of all white, all male groups of founders don't tell the entire story about what was going on there. And the other part of the answer for my game was to use a bit of creativity. The real Dr. William Shockley was a virulent racist who believed in the genetic inferiority of the black race. But what if we took his eccentricities, put them on another character, and twisted them around? Shockley believed that personality testing could objectively determine a person's intelligence, their mental temperature. What if Silicon Zero's startup was led by someone whose personality tests actually worked, and led them to hire a disproportionate number of intelligent people whose race or gender led the wider market to discriminate against them? One of the truisms of writing is that you can justify almost anything, from mechanics to plotting to characters, by applying enough imagination. And by putting in the effort to include female and minority characters, it was possible to address the historical discrimination in their conversations and interactions with others. I worried about erasing real problems by including them, but those problems were much less likely to have been addressed at all without their presence. I'm not saying your game has to include minority characters or discuss themes of discrimination, but challenging your assumptions about what your characters can be and thinking about what obstacles they faced in their fictional lives is a very strong tool for making your writing more interesting. Okay. So, I had a theme, I had a plot, and I had some characters. How did I fit them into the game? I've already mentioned the puzzle descriptions being written by individual characters. I tried to give each character a distinct writing voice, and also included portraits next to everything they said. You can see a little portrait there. People love faces. When possible, I also tried to link the puzzle mechanics to the plot directly. For example, one puzzle, this puzzle, is set in a period where the lab is in complete chaos, and so the player is forced to work without some of their normal tools. And that's actually a justification for like a little tutorial that I wanted to introduce anyway. It's possible to approach mechanical thematic synergy from a story-first or mechanics-first direction, but theme is usually more flexible. Like I said, you can justify nearly anything. So I usually find it easier to adapt the theme to the mechanics. I also added extra messages for ending each puzzle. Look, portrait. Those ended up in the game almost accidentally. I added a screen after beating a level that let you choose between going to the next level or going back, which was a UI issue I was having at the time. And I figured, hey, why not stick some more dialogue in while I'm at it? And that dialogue turned out to be a huge addition to the game. They furthered the plot and the characterization without cluttering up the screen during puzzles. And they were easily skippable for players who weren't interested. They also served the role of kind of a reward. You've beaten the level, and now you get this little chunk of plot. And it's not something that all of your players will be interested in. Some players just don't care about story at all. But it's a great motivator for players who are. Okay, back in the puzzle selection screen, which ended up looking a little different from those concepts. Same basic idea. The art conveyed the theme in a less explicit way. Scribbles and graffiti on the whiteboard added like a little personal note showing the character of the people in the lab. That's the market. While each successive set of puzzles had a more sophisticated, organized lab setup, visually showing the progress of the company from its scrappy startup roots. These are screens 1 and 2. They get more organized as you go along. The music in the puzzles also changed over the course of the game, mirroring this progression. All right. Oh, wow, I'm way ahead of time. Silicon Zeros is the most story-heavy game I've ever made, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to pull it off when I started. I think it's turned out reasonably well, though. And what I've learned is that building a story for a game mostly looks just like the rest of game development. You experiment, you test on actual players, and you iterate. History is a powerful source of inspiration and grounding, but it shouldn't actually be something that holds you back. With imagination and ingenuity, a good writer should be able to justify whatever their game needs. Write what you love and pack that love into every inch of your game. So, all right, any questions?
In case I don't catch you after, I'm really interested in the text part in between levels.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why do you think that was such a good place for people to read text? Because that's a huge issue, right? Like, people hate reading text now. Right?
Sure.
So why do you think this in particular was like a good spot for it?
I mean, I guess I would say like it's a natural pausing point to some extent. It doesn't break up the flow in a way that wouldn't be broken up otherwise. You're going to get to the screen when it says beat the level because you need somewhere to say like what do I do next? You need a dialogue for that. So it wasn't interrupting people. Like I said, it wasn't using up screen real estate, and that's already a problem for the other text. On the lower resolutions in particular, I mean you can hide it, but it does use up a lot of space while it's out. And I mean, it was just there's not that much space for text in the game generally. Like you can see, like there's a couple paragraphs here, there's a couple paragraphs there. That's what you get per level. So just essentially, more or less doubling the amount of story I was able to tell, really hugely expanded the options I had.
Yeah, I thought that was actually brilliant. Like looking at, you got these 3 buttons, and it's like, okay, that's the normal thing to do, but then it's like, oh, why not populate that, right?
Yeah.
Why not fill that void?
Yeah, since we've got something popping up and covering the screen anyway. Sure.
Is this designed mobile first, or?
No, it's not currently, it's not mobile at all right now. It's PC Mac. I'm planning, hopefully, to make a mobile port, at least for iOS, but it's not something I've even started on yet. I've been focusing on making a release for some platforms, for PC and Mac, and then other platforms later, which probably makes me a caveman. But
I just asked because it looks like it could work well on mobile.
yeah, I'm hopeful. There's some things that are going to be tricky, especially screen space is going to be really tight. It's pretty packed, but yeah.
What's your release date?
September 18th. And you can Google the game. You can get it on Steam. You can get it on itch.io. I mean, you can't get it yet because it's not out yet, but you can wish list it. You can follow it, whatever. Follow me on Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook. Join the Discord. Follow the Reddit. And probably there's something else I've forgotten. Which is so much fun. Yeah. So, okay. All right. Thank you very much for listening.